Hi, I'm James Sweeney, Professor of International Law at Lancaster University. Great to be here in Belfast at the Human Rights Centre PG conference. Earlier on this morning I gave one of the keynote speeches and I was talking about my research on human rights in Central and Eastern Europe with a particular focus on how the Council of Europe human rights mechanisms interact with policies of transitional justice. Because my sort of central observation really is that human rights and transitional justice, they don't always point in the same direction, and that states going through periods of transition from time to time have asked international courts, including the European Court of Human Rights, for special treatment on grounds of their transition. When the court grants that leeway, allows that flexibility, it gives rise to what I would call a form of transitional relativism. Now, cultural relativism is pretty well recognised in human rights scholarship. What I've tried to do is to bring some of the thinking about that to bear on the issue of transitional justice. But the paper wasn't just on sort of rights limiting issues too, rights limiting or rights restrictive policies. I looked also at rights vindicating transitional policies. So I briefly alluded to some work I'd done on post-conflict housing restitution, but more particularly had a little look at the so-called right to truth. Now, historical accounting, historical justice is hugely important, but I remain sceptical when it comes to whether there is an autonomous legal right to truth. The closest you can get is on duties to investigate circumstances in the past. Where I think it gets really interesting is when, or in fact whether, you can extend that duty back in time to before, for example, when the European Convention came into effect for a particular country. And of course, if you can, that opens the further question, how far back do you go? So interesting questions about Russian behaviour in 1940 with the Katyn massacre, but if you accept that modern human rights mechanisms can look at those circumstances, we can have a very long conversation about reparations for violations in the quite distant past.